Thanks to the choir. They were rehearsing this morning as I walked in, and when they took a pause, I peeked around the corner and said, "You sound awesome." I hope you agree with that. I had an opportunity this week to listen in on worship services from several other United Methodist churches in our area, all of them larger in membership, some of them quite a bit larger in membership and attendance, and I would say that our choir can keep up with any of them, and I really appreciate them, and especially on a day like today with such a beautiful, moving anthem, it makes my job very easy because I could just sit down and shut up now because they've already preached the word, as they say, when you sing, you pray twice, right? And they did a beautiful job with that. So good again to see all of you who are here with us on Zoom. I brought my laptop into the pulpit just so I could kind of keep track of you, so to speak. Hi, Irvin. Thank you for waving. I know some of you have your video off, and that's fine as well. But I want to warn you, I am going to be asking at least one or two questions, so you might just be ready, even with your video off, because I'm going to ask you for some responses. But first of all, as I mentioned, starting with the call of Jesus' call to the fishermen to be his disciples. It appears in multiple gospel versions in different ways. In fact, Matthew and Luke have virtually the same story, except that Luke includes this incident about the fact that when Jesus found them and first asked them if they would be willing to allow him to take a seat in their boat and they could pull out from shore just a little bit so he would have a better perspective on speaking to the gathered crowd. They didn't apparently really know him at that point, but were willing to give it a try. And then after he had finished speaking, he said, "Now, why don't you go back to your fishing again and see what happens?" And of course, Simon and Andrew, his brother, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, they kind of looked at Jesus like, what does this landlubber know? This farmer, this peasant, this carpenter, what do they know about fishing? And Simon says, "Well, we fished all night and our nets came up empty. But if you say so, okay." I'm sure as parents we've heard our children say something like that to us before. "If you're going to make me, then I guess I will," right? And so they go back out into the waters, and Jesus says, "Pull into the deeper waters and let your nets down." And into that deep darkness, they let their nets, and when they pulled it up, the net was so full that it was overflowing. And that's that beautiful graphic on the front of the bulletin today, and hopefully you got that weather virtually. And I think you had it on the slide also, didn't you, Elizabeth, the slide for the sermon? Can you bring that back up again, if it's not too much trouble? Great, thank you. Yeah, this beautiful image from John August Swanson, now deceased, but the amazing rainbow colors of the nets teeming with fish. It's also interesting that in another gospel, the Gospel of John, a story very much like this occurs once again after Jesus' death and resurrection. Simon, now Peter, and brother Andrew, James, John, and the other disciples, they did not know what to do. They were stumped. They were stymied. They were afraid. They were locked behind closed doors in Jerusalem, fearing that they too might be arrested. They might be beaten. They might be tried. They might even be killed. And so after a while, Simon Peter says, "Ah, shucks, I guess we might as well go back to fishing. What else is there, right?" And so they trudge back north to their home haunts, and they go back to their nets and their boats that had been mothballed for a while. And they go back to fishing, and sure enough, they caught nothing. Once again, they caught nothing, according to the Gospel of John. And so, as they're pulling up their nets over and over again, they're stinky, they're sweaty, they're wet, they're, probably their hands are now blistered because they lost some of those calluses they'd had all those years. And they're in their bleeding, stinking, blistery mess. They hear a voice calling from the seashore, "Try putting down your nets on the other side. Cast your nets into deeper water." Again, who was this crazy person on the seashore telling these fishermen their own business? But then, one of the disciples, perhaps John, who wrote the gospel, said, "It is the Lord." And they did put down their nets, and once again they had an amazing catch like this, and they worked and worked to bring the catch into the boat so that the boat was just overflowing the gunnels. I'm not sure if any of you have seen something like that. My older brother and sister-in-law still fish in Alaska in the summers. It's amazing to see during the halibut season, to see them knee-deep in halibut just overflowing their 27-foot, 35-foot, I think, fishing boat. It's quite remarkable to see that kind of a catch. And so when Simon Peter realized it was Jesus, what does he do? He strips off everything except for his underclothes and dives in the water and swims to shore. Now that's a whole nother story, but the point is the Gospels give us these bookend stories in which Jesus is meeting with the disciples, calling them for the first time, and then calling them once again after his death to follow him. And both times, he's telling them to put out into deeper waters, to try putting their nets down on the other side. But now I want to call attention for a minute to these fisher folk. Have any of you ever been professional fisher folk? Professional? Yeah, professional? Okay. It's pretty tough work, right? Very, very tough work. Absolutely. Yeah. And would you say that being a professional fisherman is one of the cleanest jobs there are in the world? No. No, in fact, it's probably just the opposite, right? One of the dirtiest jobs around, especially if you're talking about fish guts and scales and all that kind of stuff. And so, just like the shepherds who showed up at the manger in Bethlehem, who were considered the kind of people you didn't want to associate with because they were dirty and stinky and couldn't maintain the ritual purity that Jews required. They were outsiders and oftentimes kind of considered sort of shifty characters that couldn't really be trusted. In other words, not our kind of people. The shepherds were not our kind of people. Amen. So what about these fishermen? Are they our kind of people? Not so much. Thank you, Fred. Yeah. I mean, maybe some of you like me, maybe you caught a fish or two here or there, but it might have been more for sport or entertainment and not so much as a livelihood. So both the fisher folk and the shepherds, these are the nitty-gritty, working-class, subsistence workers of the economy in Jesus' day. And I think it's important that we note that Jesus did not call folks just like us as the first disciples, well-established, some kind of sort of middle-class, educated, relatively financially, well-off, stable people. Jesus called exactly the opposite kind of people to be his disciples. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? Are we too, like the disciples, meant to leave it all behind? To drop everything to follow Jesus? To leave family and jobs and careers and neighbors and kinfolk behind and follow Jesus? Maybe in some situations that could be. But this morning I'd like to really make the connection again between this story of Jesus calling his disciples and our own stories. Now you notice that when I talked about the shepherds and disciples, I very intentionally called them not our kind of folk. But what I want to ask us now to consider is this. How many generations back in your family story would you need to go to find folks like the fishermen and the disciples? Folks maybe who lived off the land or the waters. Folks who lived hand to mouth. Folks who suffered as the dirty masses, if you will. How many generations back would you have to go? I know in my case, it's just one. My parents grew up in Texas and experienced, while not nearly as significantly as many others or seriously as many others, my parents experienced the Depression, the drought, the Dust Bowl, and eventually migrated to Oregon after World War II and after their education. So they really kind of skirted some of the issues. But in my father's case, his father, my grandfather, was originally from Arkansas and always had in mind this idyllic image of the Arkansas Ozarks as the Garden of Eden, the land flowing with milk and honey. And so somewhere in the mid-1920s, when they were relatively successful ranchers and farmers in North Texas, which was a good time to be a farmer and rancher. You know, prices were up for commodities. They sold everything they had in Texas, put it all in a boxcar, and had the boxcar trundled by train back to Arkansas, where they purchased an orchard, a fruit orchard. So they thought, died and gone to heaven in the Garden of Eden with all this fruit around them. And that's where my father completed junior high and high school. The problem was that he was about 12 when his older brother Lester contracted appendicitis. There was no real health care as such. Their father believed that castor oil would solve anything, but that only added to the problem. So my father's older brother died from burst appendix, and at age 12, my father became the main guy, the main boy, helping their father run the farm, the orchard. Their father had some of his own disabilities. And so my father, age 12, with his younger brothers who were like 6, 8, and 10, they became the farmhands to run the orchard. Eventually, my father did graduate from high school, Lincoln, Arkansas. He was a good enough basketball player that he actually had a scholarship to go to college. 1929, 1930, thereabouts, the Depression was on. But he could not afford to not work and help support his family. And so that's what he did. And within a short time after the prices fell for all fruit, as often what happened in those days, they, in my uncle's words, they gave the keys to the farm back to the local feed and seed company because they could not pay their debts. So after pursuing their dreams in the Ozarks, they moved back again to the same region that they had left several years earlier and lived in a lean-to. That was the beginning of the Depression. For them, my mother did not fare a whole lot better, except that at one point, as is often the case, at one point her father left all of the family behind when my mother was about 4 years old and went off to California and was able to get a job because his cousin worked for the Los Angeles Police Department, and so he got an actual paying job and kept it all the way through the Depression, and that was some help. My sister, who's 7 years older than I am, put me onto a book recently, and as I often do, I'm listening to it on audiobooks from the Oregon Digital Library, so they're free. But the book is called The Four Winds. I think it's Hannah Smith, but it's The Four Winds, and it describes the experience of one family living in North Texas. They call it the Texas Panhandle, living very successfully on a farm, growing wheat until the prices of farm commodities drops in the Depression. The drought comes, the Dust Bowl comes, and the youngest child in the family almost dies from what they call apparently silica pneumonia, just from the accumulation of dust in the lungs from all the dust that's blowing in the air. He almost died. And when he finally did recover, the doctor told him, "You have to get out of this state or your son is going to die." So that was 1934. Her husband had already left her because he couldn't take it any longer. And so now the mom, with the young child, her son, and her older daughter, I think she was 12 or 13 at the time, they joined the Great Migration to California. And there they encounter people welcoming them with open arms. Not. In fact, some of the utter poverty and despair and hopelessness and prejudice and mistreatment is almost too hard to bear. It's almost too hard to listen to. You know, I hope to kind of get through that section as quickly as possible because it feels so hopeless. And what they encountered then in California, which they had, of course, been told, well, that's the land flowing with milk and honey, that's where you can find jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what they found there was living in a squatter's camp next to an irrigation ditch, subject to all of the ravages of the weather and the exploitation of the local farm landowners and the derision of the local residents who didn't want those Okies, those kind of people, anywhere near their community. They were God-fearing, tax-paying citizens of California who paid for the schools and the hospitals and on and on. They didn't want their hard-earned tax dollars going to these derelict, criminal, lazy, dirty Okies. Though they were those kind of people. We don't want those kind of people here in our community, ruining our community. Now, again, I wonder, I asked before, do you know, in terms of your own family story, what generations may have been subject to migration due to climate or economic or political or other reasons? I'm just kind of curious, and I'm wondering if you could just kind of like give me a 0 or a 1 or a 2 or a 3. If you know, like how many generations back would you need to go to find a story like this in your own family history? Any ideas? How many generations? 3, 2, 0, 1. Yeah, I see 2s and 3s. I know that we have some 90-year-olds here, 90-plus-year-olds here today. If my math serves me, I think that probably means that you were living during the time of the Great Depression, if my math is correct. And even if you weren't already living in the Great Depression, we know from the study of genetics that when our mothers were embryos in their mothers, now hear this, when our mothers were embryos in their mothers, and all of the cells that would later become eggs were formed in the embryo when they were still in their mother's womb. So in other words, even if you're one or two generations apart from conditions like the drought and depression and Dust Bowl, you almost were certainly impacted. Certain genes of ours have these dispositions that can kind of be turned on one way or other, off or on, based on the living conditions of our grandparents. There's clear scientific evidence of this. And so again, I think when we hear folks talking about those kind of people, we need to see ourselves in their shoes, in the shoes of those kind of people, because almost certainly, whether we ourselves or our parents or our grandparents or maybe even our great-grandparents, we have at some point in our family story been those kind of people. And I know in terms of my parents, they both came through the South. I know if we go far enough back, we find my mother's people coming into Virginia and the Carolinas in the 1600s. We don't know if they came freely of their own accord, or maybe they were in debt bondage, or maybe they were prisoners being transported. We don't know. But we do know in the mid-1800s, we know there are family members of ours who were very involved in the Southern cotton economy, some of whom definitely owned African-American slaves and fought on the side of the Civil War. We know that about our family. So again, there are those kind of people in my family too, people I'm not necessarily proud of them, but there they are. So when Jesus calls his disciples and he calls them from among those kind of people, what is that saying to us about our call today and our responsibility today? And this is where it might get a little close to home for some of us. And I can imagine some of you will want to shake your heads. But I'm wanting to speak with us again about Project Turnkey, a project to provide temporary, transitional, emergency housing to homeless people in Clackamas County. I've mentioned before, I think that the most recent plan of our Clackamas County Board of Commissioners is to purchase the Quality Inn that's on Sunnyside Road right next to the I-205 on ramp across I-205 from Clackamas Town Center. Some of you may have even heard or seen some recent public meetings gathering public input and opinion. We learned just this last week that someone in Clackamas County has begun to circulate a petition opposing the siting of Project Turnkey, of transforming the Quality Inn. And it starts by saying, "We, the undersigned residents, taxpayers, and business owners of Clackamas County, vehemently oppose the repurposing of the Quality Inn into a homeless shelter." And they go on to say, "The implementation of this homeless shelter would attract crime, drug use, garbage, and a general sense of insecurity to a thriving business district. Residents would have to live in fear of heightened crime and suffer loss of property values." And then the big ringer, of course, "We don't want to be like Portland." That is very evident In the nearby city of Portland, homeless shelters and services are often surrounded with street campers, drug users, human excrement, garbage, and other nuisance. There is a higher prevalence of mental illness, rampant drug use, etc., etc. So in other words, all the things that we fear most that might be invading our communities. So this is the age-old familiar tactic of using fear as a wedge issue between one group of people and another group of people, and oftentimes that is based upon identifying some other group of people who are those kind of people that we don't want to have anything to do with. Those kind of people. Now, it's also the case, in this case, that the information that's stated here as a rationale for opposition is utterly baseless, untrue, made-up stuff, because none of these things will be true in the case of a Project Turnkey homeless shelter that is owned and operated by Clackamas County, that will have full-time 24/7 security on the premises. In this case, the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office is literally across the street, practically, on the other side of 205. The Sheriff's Department, the District Attorney's Office, Human Services, mental health, physical health, they will all be surrounding the residents of Project Turnkey and helping them transition from homelessness towards more long-term housing solutions. And that may be, again, where churches like St. Paul's may come in the future if we consider making available land to create more affordable housing units, some of which might be for folks just like us, who may not have a large equity in a property or assets saved, who would benefit from safe, affordable housing. The point I'm trying to make is that it's very, very, very easy to classify those people, whoever they are, immigrants, Okies, and all the other terms we might want to think about, as those people that we don't want to have anything to do with. We don't want them in our neighborhood. Thank you very much. They should be cared for, okay, but someplace else, not around here. So this is my opinion. I'm not telling you how you should believe, but my opinion is that as disciples of Jesus Christ, we are called to lift up our voices, and particularly if you are, which I believe pretty much everybody here as I look around the room, if you are a citizen of Clackamas County, you certainly have a voice, and particularly if you happen to reside on the east side of 205, which I know some of you do, you were very welcome to raise your voices to the Clackamas County Commissioners, acknowledging the understanding that we realize this is a safe, cost-effective, compassionate way to care for people who find themselves in circumstances where they are now housing insecure, rent burdened, no longer able to keep up their payments for whatever reason. And in part, at least, I think we do well to do this because we know there but for the grace of God go us, or even, a generation ago, maybe it would have been us or our forebears. So I do hope, as we think about our call to discipleship, that we will be mindful of who the kind of people were who was Jesus' first disciples, what kind of people Jesus is calling us to be today as his disciples, and the kind of people that we are called to reach out and love. Just as we sang in our opening hymn, we are called to act with justice. We are called to love tenderly. We are called to serve one another, to walk humbly with God. Sing a new song. Sing of that great day when all will be one. God will reign and will walk with each other as sisters and brothers, united in love. Amen.